All right, let's jump into another deep dive. This time we're going all the way back to the book of Exodus.
A classic.
Definitely, chapter 30 specifically.
Okay, what's in chapter 30?
Well, we've got an excerpt from my Christian Space to guide us.
Okay.
And get this, it's all about the super specific instructions for creating the holy objects and rituals for the tabernacle.
Wow, so we're talking like blueprints for sacredness.
Exactly. Talk about detailed. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's fascinating how they were so meticulous. It really shows you how important this all was to them, right? Like how holy and sacred they viewed these objects and the actions.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, have you ever thought about what exactly went into ancient incense?
Not real.
Or why washing your hands could be a life or death situation for the priests.
Oh, wow.
I know, right? I definitely had some questions going into this, so let's dive right in. First up, we have the altar of incense.
Okay, the altar of incense.
Yeah, this is a big one.
So it was 18 inches square and 3 feet high, made of acacia wood, and then overlaid with pure gold.
Wow, they spare no expense.
Right. Even the horns had to be made from a single piece. With the altar?
They really weren't messing around. And then there's the placement, too. In front of the curtain, by the Ark of the Testimony. I mean, can you just, paint us a picture of where this altar was located?
Right. So picture this. You're standing in the holy place, just outside the veil.
Yeah.
Separating it from the most holy place.
Okay.
Where the Ark of the Covenant is.
Right.
The altar of incense is right there in that, transitional space.
Oh, I see.
Like a bridge between the earthly realm and the divine presence.
So the placement is all about being as close to God as possible. Makes sense. What was the purpose of burning incense on this altar, though?
So every morning and evening, Aaron, the high priest, would burn fragrant incense on the altar.
Okay.
It created this, pleasing aroma to God.
I see.
And symbolized the prayers and worship of the people rising up to heaven.
So it's not just about making the tabernacle smell nice. It's a way to connect with God through this symbolic act.
Right, exactly.
I like that. Now, there were some pretty strict rules about this altar, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No other offerings were allowed on the altar of incense.
Really?
Yeah, it was exclusively for the incense, highlighting its, special function in worship.
A dedicated space for a sacred act. Makes sense. But then once a year, on the Day of Atonement, there was this whole other ritual performed on the altar.
Oh, right.
What was that all about?
So on that day, Aaron would use the blood of a sin offering to atone for the altar itself.
For being altar?
Yeah, it was like a purification thing, underscoring the concept of holiness and the need to maintain ritual purity in God's presence.
Okay, so maintaining this sense of ritual purity was a really big deal. And speaking of which, this excerpt then jumps into a census. Now, what does a census have to do with atonement?
Well, it's all connected in this interesting way. See, every year, all men over 20 were required to be counted in a census, and each man had to pay a half shekel as an offering to God.
Everyone.
Regardless of their wealth, too.
Rich and poor paying the same amount. That's really interesting. Feels like a statement about equality before God.
Yeah, definitely could be interpreted that way. It really emphasizes that everyone, regardless of status, shares the same need for atonement.
And it says this payment wasn't just about atonement, but also meant to serve as a reminder of the covenant between God and Israel.
Exactly. It's like a tangible symbol of their agreement and a physical act of participating in maintaining that right relationship with them.
Okay, so we've got the altar of incense, we've got the census. Next up is the bronze basin for washing.
Oh,
This one seems a bit more straightforward. What was its purpose?
So the bronze basin was positioned between the tent of meeting and the altar.
Okay.
It was a transitional space, like a symbolic boundary between the everyday world and the sacred space of the tabernacle.
I see.
And the priests were required to wash their hands and feet there before entering the tent of meeting or approaching the altar.
So it was all about ritual cleansing before entering the presence of God. And this wasn't just a suggestion, was it? They had to do this.
Yeah, the text is super clear about the consequences for not washing: death.
Whoa. That definitely makes hand washing seem a lot more significant.
I know, right? It really highlights that reverence and awe that they had for God and the tabernacle.
Wow. Okay. Moving on to something a little less intense. Let's talk about the holy anointing oil. The excerpt goes into a lot of detail about the ingredients.
Oh, yeah, it does, like a recipe.
I know. And it calls for specific amounts of myrrh, cinnamon, aromatic cane. cassia, and olive oil.
It's almost like an ancient apothecary formula.
Right. And it was all blended together by a skilled craftsman.
A skilled craftsman, that's interesting.
Yeah, the excerpt mentions a connection between the Hebrew word used and our modern word pharmacy.
Oh, wow, that's
I
fascinating.
know, right?
Like, it wasn't just mixing ingredients, there was artistry to it, even a sense of, spiritual sensitivity, you know?
So like they were creating this sacred medicinal blend, something potent and transformative. But what was it actually used for?
Well, the holy anointing oil was used to consecrate the tent of meeting, its furnishings, and the priests themselves.
Okay, so this anointing transformed ordinary objects and people into something holy, setting them apart for God's service. I'm curious about this idea of contagious holiness, though. Can you explain that a bit more?
Okay, so imagine a powerful fragrance, right?
Mm-hmm.
When something holy was anointed, like the altar or the priest's garments, that holiness was thought to rub off on anything that touched it.
So holiness was like a transferable property. That's a really interesting concept.
It is, and it shows how God's presence extended outward from the consecrated objects to everything they touched.
So we've got these incredibly specific instructions for creating these holy objects, the anointing oil and the incense, and then these severe consequences for anyone who dared to replicate them. Why all this emphasis on exclusivity?
I think it all goes back to this concept of holiness in Exodus. You know, these substances and the rituals. They were meant to set apart the sacred realm from the ordinary, the divine from the human.
Right, that makes sense.
By carefully controlling the creation and use, the Israelites were reinforcing the authority of the priesthood and the importance of following God's commands.
So it's not just about the objects themselves, but the power and authority they represent. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we still need to dive into the fragrant world of the incense itself. What made this incense so special?
Okay, so the incense recipe, like the oil, is very specific and a little bit shrouded in mystery. It calls for equal amounts of balsam resin, arnica, galbanum, and frankincense.
Okay, those are some exotic-sounding ingredients. I'm picturing plumes of fragrant smoke filling the tabernacle. And again, just like with the anointing oil, no DIY incense allowed.
You got it. Creating it for personal use was strictly forbidden. It was holy, set apart for God alone.
Yeah, this wasn't just something you could whip up at home.
Right, so what made it so special?
Well, the ingredients probably created this amazing aroma,
I bet.
but symbolically, the incense represents the prayers and offerings of the people,
Oh,
rising up to God.
that's beautiful.
Yeah, and remember how the altar of incense was right in front of the veil?
Oh, yeah, separating the holy place from the most holy place.
Right, so as the incense burned, the smoke would, symbolically
Yeah.
carry the prayers of the people into God's presence.
Wow, that's powerful. Adds a whole other layer of meaning to it. I'm also remembering how the excerpt mentioned some uncertainty about identifying some of the ingredients.
Yeah, there's debate about the arnica and galbanum. So even though we have the formula, there's still this, mystery surrounding the incense.
A little bit of a secret ingredient. I like it. Okay, so we've got these super specific instructions for the oil, for the incense, and then those serious consequences for anyone trying to copy them. What's the big takeaway here? Why all the exclusivity?
I think it goes back to that concept of holiness in Exodus.
Okay.
These substances,
Yeah.
the rituals, they were designed to set apart the sacred from the ordinary.
Like a clear division
Exactly.
between the divine and the human.
Exactly. And by controlling the creation and use, they reinforce the authority of the priesthood and the importance of following God's commands to the letter.
So it's about more than just the objects. It's the power and authority they represent.
Absolutely.
And speaking of which, the source material talks about the skill and craftsmanship involved in creating these objects. It mentions a skilled craftsman was responsible for the oil, and that the Hebrew word used connects to our word pharmacy.
Oh, wow. That's a cool connection.
I know, right? It highlights the care and precision needed.
It wasn't just some haphazard thing.
Right. We're talking more than just mixing ingredients. There's artistry, even spiritual sensitivity in the process.
It's like those old apothecaries,
Yeah.
meticulously blending herbs and tinctures.
Exactly.
And it shows that this oil wasn't just about a nice smell.
There was something deeper there.
Yeah, it was about creating something potent, something that could transform and heal.
This is really making me think differently about these rituals. It's not just about rules. It's about expressing devotion and living by your values.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And while those specific rituals from Exodus might not be part of our lives now, the principles behind them are still relevant.
Totally.
It's about approaching the divine with reverence and respect,
Right.
and recognizing the power of ritual and symbolism to connect us to something bigger.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Exodus 30, we're left with a powerful message. Holiness isn't just for ancient rituals, it's something we can cultivate in ourselves, our homes, our communities.
Beautifully said. It's about recognizing the worth and dignity of all creation, treating each other with respect and compassion, and living in alignment with our values.
And in a world that feels so chaotic, I think that's a message we all need to hear.
Absolutely.
But before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. We've seen how the Israelites used objects and rituals to create that sense of holiness, to connect with God. But how do we do that today in our modern world?
That's a great question. What objects or rituals or practices help us connect to something bigger, to experience that awe and wonder?
Yeah, exactly. It could be a walk in nature, a moment of quiet reflection, sharing a meal with loved ones.
All beautiful examples.
What makes something sacred for you? I encourage everyone to explore that.
Yeah, it's a challenge, isn't it? To find those modern day equivalents, like the bronze basin or the altar of incense, things that help us, even now, mark the sacred.
And I think it can go beyond just objects, too.
Right.
It could be a ritual or a place or a piece of music, anything that helps us step outside of the everyday and connect with that, like something bigger.
Oh, absolutely. For some people, it might be being in nature, like going for a walk and feeling that sense of awe at the universe. And for others, it might be something like a concert or a sporting event, feeling that shared energy.
I love those examples. And what about the everyday rituals we make, like without even realizing it?
Oh, yeah, totally.
That morning cup of coffee enjoyed in silence, or lighting a candle at dinner, or just taking a moment to watch a sunset.
Those are all great examples. It's about
It is.
finding those small moments that help us to kind of ground ourselves
Yeah.
and connect with our values, and appreciate the beauty around us.
And it's important to remember, it doesn't have to be this big, elaborate thing. Holiness can be found in those simple acts, the quiet moments.
Exactly. It's about being intentional, bringing awareness to our lives,
Yeah.
and finding those sparks of the sacred in the ordinary.
So as we wrap up our deep dive on Exodus 30, I think the message is pretty clear. Holiness isn't confined to these ancient rituals or faraway temples. It's something we can cultivate.
Within ourselves,
Yeah.
in our homes or communities.
Exactly. Beautifully said.
It's about recognizing the worth of all creation,
Yes.
treating each other with respect, compassion, and trying to live by our values.
And I think in a world that feels so chaotic and disconnected right now, that's a message we could all use. So let's all go out there and create some holiness, one intentional act, one mindful moment at a time.
I love it.
And until next time, keep diving deep, keep seeking knowledge, and keep exploring the richness and complexity of the world around us.